In this video, I'll be going over a general overview of the Ruy Lopez opening and highlighting a top-tier Grandmaster game with this opening. Now, the Ruy Lopez is very solid. It starts with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop b5. Now, the idea here with this bishop b5 move, as compared to something like bishop to c4 with the Italian, is that there is more pressure against this knight. And typically, you see a couple of main responses. A6 is generally the most popular move, or knight f6. I'd like to talk a little bit about A6 first. This is known as the Morphe's defense. And here, white has two options. Take the knight and then take this pawn, which will be hanging, or simply drop the bishop back. Now, the first move is taking. Now, whether black plays b takes or d takes, it doesn't really matter. White is going to capture this pawn on e5, and after something like queen e7 and d4, there's some complex theory. However, it will be black who is winning, because maybe after like f6 or something, there will be queen takes e4 x-raying, and it will be black who will have the better game. Now, the other alternative here, rather than d takes, is b takes. However, this is still winning after knight takes e5 and queen e7, a similar situation before d4, d6, and it will be black who has the best game here. Because again, after the knight drops back, there is simply queen takes e4, and after queen e2 takes, it will be black who's ahead in development. Now the other response, if we go back here, after a6, is bishop to a4, which is the most common move. Now here, you typically see knight f6 or d6. However, sometimes if you're a beginner under around 13 or 1400 rating, you might see b5. b5 is a little bit pushy because after bishop b3, white is simply ahead in development. The bishop went from this diagonal to this diagonal, and we can see that black is a little bit overcommitted in the endgame. These pawns could become weak after something like a4. Now, the other responses that you'll see here, if we go back, is knight f6, which is the main move, and it'll go into some complex theory after something like castles or d3. However, I will explain that later. Now, the second main move you'll see after bishop b5 is a6. Sorry, not a6. It is knight f6. Now, knight f6 is known as the Berlin defense. This has become very common recently among the top players, and that is simply because black looks to counter push and be more aggressive as compared to this a6 move, which is a little bit more passive. Now, the theory becomes very complex here, and in general, there are two main moves that white will play, d3 or castles. Now, I'd like to start with d3 because it's a little bit simpler. Simply just defending the pawn, and after something like d6 or a6, it'll be a more or less equal game with white still having a slight advantage. Now, it becomes complex when white plays castles, which is in fact the best move. Just giving up the pawn, but after rook e1 here, the pawn will be gained back for white. Now, the second move you'll see here is d4, which is the main line of the Ruy Lopez. This will go into an open system after something like takes and rook e1, followed by d5. There's some complicated theory. However, just like many other open positions with this opening, it is winning for white. In general, black in this opening wants to keep the position closed because it is white who is ahead in development, and while black is up a pawn, white can simply regain it with something like knight takes or queen takes, and this pin, followed by this pin, and then the knight will be coming in, bishop could come in, this knight will come in, and overall it'll be a very, very good game for white. So that is the overall basic overview of some of the simple theory in the Ruy Lopez. Obviously, there are much more complicated lines, and if you truly want to get good at the game, maybe if you want to play this opening yourself, I'd recommend that you look at a little bit more detailed theory. The lines will continue, maybe up to even 20 moves into the game. However, this is just a general overview. Now let's take a look at a game with the Ruy Lopez Opening. This is a game between two super grandmasters, some of the best players in the world right now, and I won't spoil who wins, however, this is a close competitive game. I'll be highlighting some aspects of the game, however, the main focus is on the opening, of course, and I'll talk about this general strategy that both players use, as well as some theory. Now, I mentioned this game has the Ruy Lopez in it. We discussed earlier that it starts with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop to b5. And black chooses to play knight f6. And I mentioned that this a6 move is the main move. And that goes into the mainline theory. However, I also mentioned that knight f6 is becoming increasingly popular as theory evolves with the whole idea of computers in modern chess. Well, the theory is always changing, and computers have started to realize that knight f6 is the favored move. This is known as the Berlin defense. We see castles, which leads into an open system after knight takes e4, d4, and knight d6. Now, I did not mention knight d6 when we talked briefly about the theory. However, this is also a very logical move, just attacking the bishop. But it is not the best move because there's bishop takes c6, d takes c6, and d takes e5, and white is ahead in development. Now, I mentioned that this whole move, if we go back right here, this knight to e6 move isn't the best, and you might be wondering, with the whole idea of computers analyzing the best theory, shouldn't these grandmasters be studying all the best moves? Well, you need to find a balance between playing the best moves and playing something that your opponent will not be able to predict. So possibly in this position, white may have prepped d5. However, knight to e6 mixes it up very nicely and changes the position. So these are the next couple of moves, as I mentioned, and knight f5. Now, knight f5 could become a very active piece, this knight here, later on in the game, because after takes, and rook d1, the queens are traded off, and we know for sure we're going to go into an endgame. Now, let's talk about the pros and cons of each player. Now, white is ahead in development. We can see that black only has one developed piece, black cannot castle, and overall, this bishop will come active, this knight could come into the game. However, the weakness is the e-pawn. This is not technically an isolated pawn because the f-pawn could come in and help with f4. However, it is a positional weakness. Now let's talk about black's position. Now black is behind in development, as I mentioned, with only this knight coming alive. However, this bishop could come easily to c5. This bishop will come in to e6 to barricade the pawn. The rook will come in, this rook will come in, and overall, black has a more versatile game. You see king to e8. Now you might be wondering, why doesn't black play king to e7? Well, after bishop to g5. Well, overall, it's just developing one piece for white with check. So black plays king to e8, knight c3, and bishop to e7. Now, bishop to e7 looks like a slightly defensive move as compared to something like bishop to b4. However, the idea behind this move is that black will play knight h4 and hopefully trade off this knight, making this pawn even more weak in the future. We see g4, which isn't exactly the best move because it pretty much falls into black's plans and encourages the move knight to h4. So this is sort of a small blunder by white. However, after takes, there is enough reinforcement with this pawn with moves like h3 and f3, which you'll see later on, that hopefully white will be able to use the pawn majority, these 4 pawns on 3 pawns here, and overrun black on the king side. We see king to g2, and the bishop cannot take because of rook d4, which just skewers the bishops. Bishop to e6, as I mentioned, this move is very logical, just blocking off this pawn. Maybe this bishop will be able to come in and reroute here to attack this pawn, and overall this pawn could become a weakness. However, this whole idea of f4 has been opened up. We see h3 defending the pawn, h5 attacking and probing these weak kingside pawns, f3, bishop to e7, rerouting the bishop from this weak square to hopefully something like b4 or c5, bishop to f4, and a5. Now, a5 is a positional improvement by black, and you'll see this a lot, this whole idea of a5. Sometimes in other games, you'll see h5, or for white, you'll see like h4, a4, and white does in fact play a4 immediately, simply blocking it off. And the idea here is that black simply wants to ram the pawn in and disrupt white's structure along the queen side. And sometimes players will do this and simply just give up the pawn. And the idea here is that if black is allowed to play this, well, the disrupted structure plus the pawn majority here on the queen side means that black will be completely winning and a passed pawn will be generated. And in the end, white is most likely to lose the endgame. So a4, rook d8, b3. Now b3 is a slight inaccuracy in my opinion, and that is simply because it just encourages bishop to b4 and then maybe something like bishop to c5, and this bishop will be a lot better than this knight. However, after something like rook to d7, which is played, and knight e4, this bishop to b4 move suddenly doesn't make sense, and this bishop c5 move can't be played anymore. So we see b6. b6 may not look like the best move at first, because now this pawn is weak. However, after c5, black will be able to use these double pawns here on the c-file and over on white. I mentioned this whole idea of the pawn majority. You can see a 4 on 3 on the queen side, whereas white has the 4 on 3 on the king side. So in this sense, it's sort of like a race in a way, and that is because both players are trying to push as quickly as possible and generate a passed pawn on their respective sides of the board. We see knight g5, and this is a very logical move. The idea is that since black has the what is known as the bishop pair, which has an advantage over the knight and bishop, that white just wants to trade it off. Now, I'll briefly talk about the bishop pair. The bishop pair is used typically in endgames, and the idea is that these two bishops will be superior to the knight and bishop. And you might be wondering, like, aren't all these four pieces equal? Aren't knights equal to bishops? Well, in general, bishops are slightly better, and if the bishops are together, they can dominate the diagonal and restrict this king, and this rook may not be able to come out. Overall, black will be winning. So we see bishop to c5, bring the bishop open, and white simply just trades. Now, this is a very interesting move because this knight right now is better than this bishop. However, in the long run, bishop could open up with something like bishop to d5, and this knight could possibly become weaker after something like f6. So, white just plays knight takes e6, keeping in mind that in the long run, in future moves, it is most likely to be this bishop, which is superior to the knight. So we simply see a trade, and rook takes d7, king takes d7, rook d1, and king c8, which is the first major blunder, I would say. Now, I mentioned that king e7 here is met with bishop to g5. We saw that earlier. So king e8 is the best move. King c8, which tries to bring the king around this way, is not the best move because these pawns here are more progressed than these pawns. I mentioned that this is a race, and keeping the king on the queen side means that these pawns will be able to push faster. We see bishop to g5 and b5, which is another mistake, just being a little bit too pushy, overextending a little bit. And the idea is that after g takes and rook takes, which is another blunder, because there is rook d8, king b7, f4, and we can see that these pawns are slowly going to come forward. F5 clears the way for this pawn to come down the board, and possibly these pawns may just not be fast enough to come all the way down here. Rook h7, h4, g6, and king f3. Now, king f3 is a very logical move, and in fact here it is just completely winning for white. The king is going to come in, this rook is dominating here, this bishop could come in, and overall these pawns are just going to push and it will be white who wins this race. King g7, sorry, rook g7, king g4, bishop to e7, bring the bishop back, rook d7, bishop f6, we see a trade of rooks, and h5, g takes, king c8, king g6, and here it is +9 for white, so black resigns here on move 35 of the game. So a very short game. However, I highlighted some opening theory here, as well as some middle game positional improvements and some ideas, as well as the end game theory that won white the idea. Now, I hope you guys enjoyed this game. It was one of the best games played in the Ruy Lopez opening, as well as some of the theory that I discussed in the beginning of the video. Thanks for watching.